entitled The Environmental Elements of Security. So we have an interactive element to this session, and we'll be using something called Menti to facilitate this. And I do hope that you're all going to participate in this by following the link and answering the questions that we actually put to you. We'll also be taking your questions and answering these at the end of the session. So please feel free to add any of your questions at any time into the Q&A function that you've got on your screens. You know, I'm fortunate to be joined by some fantastic speakers in this session, and I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves to you today in the order that they're going to speak. So Aravind, over to you for your introduction, followed by Michelle, Alison, and then last but not least, Richard. And bless you, Aravind, you're on mute, I'm afraid.
Hi, thank you, Hazel. Thank you. Technical issues to start the day. Thank you for having me on the panel. My name is Aravind. I'm the Director of Strategy for Space at Tomorrow.io, a weather intelligence company, and I'm excited to be on the panel.
Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Clamidine. I'm a current remote sensing researcher at McMaster University in Canada, and I'm really excited to present today. So thank you very much for joining in.
Wonderful. Alison, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alison Hall. I'm the founder of a small charity based in the UK called Seeds for Development, working with communities in northern Uganda. And I also work with Richard at Alcis. Over to you.
Thanks, Alison, and hello to all. My name is Richard. I'm the Managing Director of Alcis, which is a company that helps those working in fragile and conflict-affected states to better understand the challenges they face and how they can make better donor investment decisions.
Thank you very much and welcome to you all. So let me set the scene for everybody that's joining us this afternoon. You know, the consequences of a warmer climate and increasingly intense, frequent and unpredictable weather extremes are bleak. Higher temperatures and heat waves, fire, erratic rainfall and violent storms that wash away soil and harvests and infrastructure, extended droughts, desertification, rising sea levels and disrupted seasons endanger people's lives. Growing climate risks also threaten physical and mental health, food and economic security. And each year, 20 million hectares of agricultural land becomes either too degraded for crop production or is lost due to urban sprawl. Climate risks exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and inequalities. And in recent years, concern has been growing about security risks resulting from climate change, as have warnings that a changing climate could provoke increased tensions, a succession of complex situations and forced displacement. Climate migration can cause hostility, turning neighbours into enemies and lead to intercommunal tensions. Conflict due to lack of access to water or competition to land and so on typically creates internal displacement before it reaches a level where it displaces people across borders. There are currently no legal protections, asylum for climate migrants in international law, and in many places, Indigenous relationships to land and natural resources continue to go unrecognised. We know that countries in situations of armed conflict are disproportionately affected by climate variability and extremes. This is in part because of their geographical location, but mostly because conflicts and their consequences limit the adaptive capacity of people, systems, and institutions. And currently 60% of the 20 countries considered to be most vulnerable to climate change are also affected by armed conflict. Everyone in our beautiful blue world has the right to feel secure, but climate change is unfair. It further weakens those who are already struggling and have limited means and social capital to overcome the consequences of global warming. The survival and identity of people across the world is intrinsically connected to their environment and a predictable climate. So this session will focus on 4 elements of climate change that contribute to global instability and socioeconomic security issues: water, fire, air, and earth. And our speakers will discuss case study examples centered around these key elements and how the effects of a changing climate enhance the vulnerability of people, leading to increasing tensions and forced displacement. And finally, we'll ask the question, what, if anything, can be done to support those affected by climate change to adjust, adapt, prosper, and feel secure in the place that they call home, and how geospatial data can play a valuable role in achieving this. So let me introduce you to our first element, air, and more specifically, weather. And I'll hand over to you, Aravind.
Thank you, Hazel. Thank you. My name is Aravind. I'm the Director of Strategy for Space at Tomorrow.io. And as Hazel mentioned, I'm going to be dealing with the first element, which is weather, and which is also linked a little bit to air. So before I introduce Tomorrow and what we do, I wanted to set the stage in terms of talking about what we're dealing with today. So climate change is affecting everyone, right? That is a reality that we're living in, but the reality is also that some are affected more than the others. You know, the people who are affected are disproportionately affected, and we see that on the news almost on a daily basis these days. And I want to highlight a couple of examples here. One is the first climate change famine, which was happening in Madagascar just earlier this year. And there have been a number of reports that you might have come across of how climate change has the probability or the possibility to trigger a lot of deaths and displacements of people. And the speakers coming up later are going to be dealing with a few other elements, are going to talk about how people are affected and what we can do about. But the third graphic that you see is what I want to focus on during this presentation, is about weather. And according to a recent report from the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, the numbers say that over 90% of deaths happen in emerging markets. Let's think about that for a bit. Over 90% of deaths due to weather-related disasters, climate-related disasters, are happening in emerging countries, and a lot of them centered in Africa. And this is mostly because a lot of Africa do not have the weather infrastructure in place. And again, from the same report, 64% of African countries do not have any early warnings at all. So the early warning systems that we are so used to in the Western world, of there's going to be a flood, there's going to be a tornado, there's going to be heavy showers that that we almost take for granted, it's not there in a lot of the part of the world, and especially in Africa, the infrastructure is not there. That's basically the reality that we're living with. And this is basically fueling the inequities of climate change, because lack of weather data means that you don't have access to the early warning systems. You don't get alerts on time. Here, we're used to getting, things 1 week ahead, 2 weeks ahead. Granted, there is, some inaccuracies with respect to how much rainfall is going to occur, but then, we get that at least in a couple of days. But in a lot of part of the world, especially in Africa, if you were to take that as a case study, it doesn't happen. You see on the screen, there are three elements to weather, right? Like there is observations, you need to collect the data, but then the data by itself does not do anything, because you need to forecast the weather, put them into context, build the weather models. And then finally, you get that information across to people, 3 stages of weather, let's put it that way. Obviously, you can fix the first stage, and I'm going to touch on that in a bit about how we can fix the observations, how we can collect more data. So on the right, you see a graphic of all the ground radars that are there available around the world. You can already start to see the inequality that I was discussing earlier. The ground radars are basically the instruments that are used to collect how much rainfall is going on over an area of interest. And today you have only one satellite that does that. That's from NASA, called Global Precipitation Mission, GPM. And the radars that are there around the world support that in real time. And this is crucial for the forecasts, because if you don't have that data, it's impossible to give a forecast for how much rainfall is going to happen in the future, right? So the real-time collection of observation is very important, but that is not happening properly or equally, so to say. you see the concentration even in the developed parts of the world. If you look at North America, the weather radars are there, but they're still sporadic. And if you look at Africa, they're basically close to none. So there is a lot of gaps in observations, which we need to acknowledge. And the forecast, once you collect the observations using machine learning and the advancements in artificial intelligence these days, you can improve the forecasts. But then what we don't talk about a lot is the third part, and that's what a lot of my presentation is going to focus on, is the last mile. How do we get this data to people? Because even if observations are done and the value is not passed on to people, it's there's no value out of weather forecasting if there's no action based on the forecast that was given. And with Africa, we have an opportunity, because we know that Africa is it's advancing or leapfrogging the West in terms of their usage of mobile devices. And there's going to be a lot more users in Africa of mobile phones, more so than in different parts of the world. So how can we use that to solve the climate inaction or the climate adaptation? And what we hear from people also is that you see a quote on the right from people who mentioned that the temporary solutions there don't work. You can try and install weather stations. You can try and have temporary fixes done, but it's not going to work because they end up getting broken or they end up getting destroyed, as given by the quote here. And it's also the reality that low-income countries do not spend a lot on weather. And what does this mean in the context of climate change? It goes back to what I said before about early warning systems and what we need to have in place so that people who are living in different parts of the world, in different parts of the emerging countries, the developing countries, how can we let them stay where they are and not let them get displaced? And weather is a very, very important part of it. And as the graph shows here, they don't spend enough, and obviously a lot of the budget that's being spent is from the high income countries. So there is an inequality there, and we need to discuss how we're going to deal with this inequality globally speaking. What we do at Tomorrow is our mission is to help countries, businesses, and individuals better manage their growing climate security challenges through weather intelligence. And I want to stress on weather intelligence for a bit. So what is weather intelligence? You've probably heard of weather forecast. Weather forecast is when you get an alert on your mobile phone, or you see it on TV, or you hear it on radio, that there's a 40% chance of rain wherever you are tomorrow. That's weather forecast. Or there's going to be 100 kilometers per hour winds from the northeast tomorrow. That's a forecast. That's very useful. And again, the observations and the modeling that we discussed earlier is very important in getting to that forecast. But what's important is that forecast is in most cases not actionable, especially for people like us, especially if you're talking with a farmer in Africa. He needs intelligence. And that's kind of what we mean by weather intelligence, where it's about actionable insights that can help people solve a problem or go about their lives. And that's weather intelligence. And that's what we as Tomorrow are doing. Just to give you a quick overview of who we are, we're a company based in Boston, and we've been funded over $200 million. We have offices around the world. We have almost 200 people working, and we have a lot of brands that use Tomorrow, from the US Air Force to National Grid in the US, which is an energy company, to rail companies, to JetBlue, airline companies. All of them use weather. So, of course, I don't have to emphasize that weather is important for everyday life all around the world. And what we provide is weather intelligence through our platform. And what we're about to do is we're about to launch our own weather radar constellation. I talked about the lack of observations around the world and the inequality with respect to how much data we collect in different parts of the world. Well, we're going to address that by going to space. And that's where the space component comes in. The geospatial component is great once we have made the observations, but we need to make the observations, right? So we need to have the observation, or we need to fill the data gap in observation. That's what we aim to do with our satellite constellation. We are our first 2 satellites launching next year. And the idea is that we have weather data, especially data about the precipitation, the rainfall happening in different parts of the world. So we have global rainfall data available to us every hour, and done in a way that is much more cost efficient. That can then be plugged in to the forecasts. which is going to be important to bring weather intelligence to people around the world. I talked about how it's important to let people stay where they are, because obviously we have a lot of studies about how much climate change has the potential to displace people. So it's important to realize what we need to do in order to provide them insights with respect to weather, in this case, so that they can continue living about their lives. Hopefully they can continue living about their lives through the intelligence that we can provide them. What we provide is through a vertically integrated solution. So we collect our own data, we build our own models. So we have a team of scientists working on our own weather models, which will then be used to get the message across to people, which is through a platform as I show here. But we also have our mobile app. We also have the platform that people can use to get insights. So we are a vertically integrated company, and that's where the importance of sending the message around weather intelligence matters. So there is an enormous opportunity in front of us right now. There is weather intelligence, which has the potential to lift people from poverty, because all they need is these insights to get out of poverty and to go about living their lives. The early warning systems that I mentioned that we take for granted, they can receive that. And more importantly, what's important is to receive it in a way that makes sense for them, right? It's not just about getting a weather alert, but getting a weather alert that makes sense. So if you're a farmer, you don't know what 40% chance of rain means. You can't plan for that. So it's important that the intelligence that I mentioned earlier, whatever for whatever the forecast is, if it's given in a way that people can understand, it has the potential to make people adapt to climate change better and faster, simply because they can process what they're getting. And I'm going to highlight a couple of examples here. And before that, how we do that is to just add rules. Obviously there's a lot of intelligence in the background. There's geospatial data sets in the background. There's weather models in the background. But at the end of the day, what people, businesses, and governments care about is what they need to do. If you're a farmer, you just need to know when to spray your fertilizer, right? So that's an example. So that's what I mean by intelligence. If you're a government and you're planning for disasters in any part of the world, you need to know when the disaster is going to happen, so that you can then plan for those disasters and get the insights necessary to plan for those disasters. So what Tomorrow does is, this is an example from our platform, the first example on the left. Here you see a platform where weather is visualized. Clouds and thunderstorms and hurricanes are all highlighted here visually. But then what this means is people can then have access to this, so that they can visualize what kind of weather impact it's going to have for them. They can see the different parameters that's linked to weather. Weather, as you might imagine, is linked to all of or most of the elements that we're going to discuss today. Air quality, it's about the direction of the wind and how the particles move over a surface. It can be soil and how that's moved over an area, again through wind. It can also be wildfires. The wildfires and weather are very interrelated. So the platform helps people visualize that. So that's where the weather intelligence for individuals, businesses, and governments matter. And one example that I want to present here is our example from a locust project that we do. And I have to say that at Tomorrow we have a nonprofit arm called tomorrownow.org, and there's going to be a separate session on Friday at 3 p.m. GMT, where we look into these case studies even more. But here I want to talk about a small example of how everything that I've mentioned gets to the people. So here an example is I think I don't need to set the context of the locust challenge in Africa and what we saw in the last year about the kind of damage that it has done to ecosystems and to people's lives, really. So what we did for the locust project is basically to supply intelligence in a way that people can understand. I talked about how Africa's mobile ecosystem and their usage of mobile services is very high. So all they need is to know when there is a locust warning, and then get it in a way that makes sense for them, so that they can plan if it's for their crops, or if it's for their livelihoods. And everything that I mentioned before, the space technologies, the geospatial technologies, and the weather models, all of that need to be converted into a format that people would understand. And in this case, people would understand, a weather alert that is given through WhatsApp more so than any other format that I've discussed. They don't need a platform. They don't need to log on to their computer. All they need is a weather alert. And it's important that we discuss not only the technologies that are used to give these weather alerts, but the focus needs to be also on how it's delivered to those people. And essentially, that is one of the most important discussions that we need to have, because the space technologies, we're going to invest in space technologies ourselves, and there are a number of companies who are going to invest in collecting different types of data, geospatial data, weather data, emission data, whatever it is. And then there is the processing bit. We're going to have advancements in cloud and artificial intelligence, again, which enable us and our modeling, but it's going to enable a lot of, modeling around the world and advancements around the world. But then the most important bit is the last bit. How are we going to deliver this intelligence to people? And that's where I want to leave this panel with, and the audience with, is we need to be thinking a lot about how we're going to deliver this intelligence, especially if you're thinking about the emerging market, countries around the world where they don't even have good internet access. They don't have, definitely they don't have the infrastructure like we do in terms of connectivity and mobile phones and computers. So it's important to think about how we're going to highlight and deliver this intelligence to people so that they can continue being where they are. Climate change is real. There's going to be a lot of discussion around mitigation this week in COP26, but then we need to also talk a lot about adaptation, and part of that discussion revolves around how we're going to deliver these insights. And in my case, I presented weather and how we can deliver weather intelligence to these people. But then any other technology and any other insight, it's important to have these discussions around intelligence. And that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. And I'm here for any questions, and thank you for listening.
Aravind, thank you so much for opening this session with that presentation. Really informative. Just a quick reminder to everybody that we have a Q&A function, and our speakers will be absolutely devastated if they don't get a question from you. So please pop that into the Q&A session. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to pass the floor to Michelle, who's going to discuss our second and third elements, fire and water. So over to you, Michelle.
Great, thank you very much, Hazel, for that introduction. And I just wanted to say thanks, Arvind, for setting us up with sort of leadway into what I'll be talking about today. Two of the elements that I would like to cover today is fire and floods, because this is particularly impactful in the Amazon, especially right now. And a lot of you would have heard, especially in 2019, about the impact of fires that was occurring throughout the Amazon, and particularly in Brazil, and what's happening there. And a lot of this fire we sort of mapped starting previously, but just to highlight some of the work that we were doing in 2019 and 2020 were very impactful on where they were occurring. It wasn't just occurring in areas that were previously deforested, but also opening up new sort of areas and zones. And you can sort of see where these patterns of fires tends to occur. And a lot of it was based on new areas opening up for pasture, cattle ranching, agriculture, and even gold mining to a lot of extent, especially small scale gold mining. So for instance, in Brazil, one of the key issues when we're using fire is that fire is often used on land that has not been identified as legal ownership. So for instance, if there's a plot of land that no one owns, what tends to happen is people go clear it and then sort of say, oh, this is my area. And that tends to be a problem, especially when there is communities that have not received title as yet. And this tends to occur not only in Brazil, but throughout the Amazon, throughout South America in particular. And this, you can see that it brings a lot of conflict, because as fires tends to increase, especially through El Nino, and the intensity and frequency of it is increasing. There's lots of data, lots of research that's coming out, especially from the University of Leeds and so forth, about the intensity of El Nino and the frequency of it. Historically, you'd hear stories from communities where, you know, they saw a lot of El Ninos happening maybe 10 years, but now the frequency is every almost 5 years or so. And how they adapt to this is an issue, especially on the ground. One of the things that tends to happen is that, you know, they're seeing a lot of their farmlands being burnt. They're not sure how to control it, especially if it's set not just from climate change, but also people using the El Nino situation, the dryness, the droughts that are occurring to set fires into their lands and destroying their crops. One of the issues that we've sort of seen on the ground is that a lot of farms are being burnt, and that has issues on food security. We've seen people actually moved out of communities because of this dryness, of the droughts that have occurred because of the fires. Sort of recycling of the vegetation takes quite a few years, almost 5-10 years, for areas to rest, to really get back the nutrients that they need. A good example of this is areas like Masakanari, the Waiwai village in Guyana, where some parts of their land was, they used to live in an area called Akontafono, but because of fires, because of rising river levels, they've had to move further inland and onto mountains, areas that they've never previously really lived on. So they're moving from a sort of savanna areas into more forested, mountainous areas that they've never, as I said previously, used, where they've had to move their entire villages towards. The other aspect of it is that because of this whole cycle of El Nino and La Nina occurring, a lot of flooding has occurred, especially this year. They've seen unprecedented amount of flooding throughout the region. Their farmlands are being affected, so especially crops that they use that are considered very staple to their diet, so like cassava or manioc. They're seeing a lot of it being rotten because the soil is waterlogged. And again, it's to find areas that does not flood, especially if you're in lowland areas. You're now having to go to up on mountains, which is very hard to farm on for a lot of these communities. And so there's a couple of things that tend to happen is that they either move entirely out of communities, or they start to go on to neighboring villages' land, which can create a lot of conflict. And this is just some images that I've shown of like the cassava plant being waterlogged, and even some of the farms down in Guyana, and what tends to happen when a lot of farmlands or areas that are previously considered good for farming gets waterlogged, as has happened this year during the La Nina. It also tends to affect a lot of communities because they tend to use a lot of roads, a lot of trails in order to carry their produce to markets. So this is a good example of what happened in Guyana and even in Brazil this year, where a lot of rivers have flooded over, and a lot of their even homes have been damaged because of the flooding. And communities now have to consider, where do they go next, because they're seeing not just this year, but rising river levels consistently happening. Even the ant, as you can see from this little image up here, is starting to adapt to some extent on how they have to deal with this rising water levels. So there's a couple of things that tends to happen here, is that communities, one of it is communities, because the sustainability of the community is now in question. Where do they farm? Where do they build their houses? And that brings in a lot of economic issues as well. So for example, how do they get bank loans from, from wherever, loans from, well, either banks or neighboring lending agencies? They can't just go and say, oh, we have tenure land, we'd like to collect a loan from you, because the banks don't recognize tenure ownership of land. And so one of the things they do is that they then move into cities and try and buy houses as families. So you're seeing a lot of movements from indigenous or local communities to cities because there's ownership of land and houses individually or as a family. And then they can say, okay, well, I can then take this land tenure here, get my loan, and then give it back to the community, go back to the community and build my farm again or build my homes again. Sometimes that doesn't even happen because a lot of young people then just move to the cities. They see they have access to a lot more resources, and then they don't, unfortunately, go back. The other issue, as I mentioned, is this conflict with neighboring communities. Because of how a lot of communities are laid out, especially in the Amazon, they tend to be neighboring to each other. And if one area is affected, they can't just pick up and go somewhere else to farm because they have particular boundaries towards them. So they can sometimes be affected by if they're trying to access farms for for their food. They're going into neighboring villages, which can cause a lot of conflict, and then that brings up issues about hunting rights and so forth. The other issue that we've seen throughout this, especially when it comes to fire and floods, is that oftentimes there's an economic force that may drive it, but climate plays a much bigger role. So for example, in Venezuela, because of the 2016 economic crisis that occurred there, they sort of opened up the Orinoco Beltway to mining. But because of the droughts that occurred and because of increase in fires, one of the things that is happening is that they're seeing a lot of displacement of people. It may started out as an economic issue, but the droughts and the fires are actually driving communities into other areas. And that is a part of the reason why you see this sort of mass exodus of communities as well into places like Guyana, into Suriname, into Brazil, and even into Colombia as well. So it may be initiated by an economic force, but climate is playing such a huge role in where people can settle and where people tend to go. Unfortunately, one of the things we're finding is that there's not a lot of good documentation as to this sort of small scale, maybe local or regional migration pattern that is happening. And I think this is something that, especially as researchers, we need to sort of document. One of the things that communities have started to adapt, thanks to the availability of things like GPS and even drones, is to map their areas and see, for example, what resources do they have in their land, so that if there is issues with droughts or with floods, where else can they go? So, for example, with Masakanari and the Waiwais, they did a whole community management plan, and they did it in almost like a 20-year cycle. So that for the first 10 years, this is where we're going to farm, this is where we're going to fish, this is where we're going to have our communities. And then in the next 10 years, we're going to move to these areas, and then they can see how the weather pattern, for example, sort of shifts according to what's been happening. And so they have been able to sort of document all the resources that they have on their lands, but also planning a bit better for the future as an example of that. So with that, I think I would like to hand over back to Hazel, and I look forward to the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Michelle. Really interesting presentation there. I'm going to see if we can open Menti. Who knows? Technology is always a challenge. It may work, it may not work. But Anita, let's see if we can open Menti to our audience for our first question. And please participate if you can. So the question that we wanted to ask you is, given the examples, that we heard from Michelle, would you be tempted to move away from your home because of the challenges that you face? So we're going to ask to see if it's going to be a yes, no, or a maybe from you. What I would also say is while we're waiting for all of you to participate in Menti, I'm also going to be, I'm going to do it as well, by the way. I'm also going to see whether or not you're tempted to put some questions, to populate some questions in the Q&A box for our speakers. As I said before, they're happy to answer any questions from you today, and there's no such thing as a silly question. There may be some silly answers that come up, but I don't think there's going to be any silly questions. So let's see if we can actually get some results from our Mentimeter and see what's going on there. Be interesting to see whether or not we see people sitting on the fence and going, maybe, don't know. And it may well be that actually you need some more answers to questions that have come into your mind that we can ask Michelle at the end to actually help you. Wow, let's have a look at that one. We can see now that actually, thank you for your participation, everybody. And we can see now that the majority of people are actually tempted to move away from home because of the challenges that are faced. And that's not to be taken lightly, is it? We've heard about some of the challenges that we can see from that one, you know, that Michelle's actually outlined for us today. But there's a strong indication there that a lot of you might be tempted in those situations to actually move away. You know, and those climate shocks do give those drastic changes, don't they, on people's lives and livelihoods, and do compel them to move from home, as we've heard from Michelle, you know, and it does contribute to urbanisation in poor and overcrowded neighbourhoods, you know. But for others who are affected by the dual shock of maybe conflict and climate change, the option of moving to a refugee camp may be the only solution. And I know the International Organisation for Migration estimates that in 2019, 25 million people were displaced by climate change related events. And I'm going to ask you, actually, let me ask you another question. We talk about what's known as climate refugees. And we're going to go to this on Menti as well. So I have another Menti question for you while we're here, and we'll come back to the answers later. So the next question on your Menti is really, you know, when we're talking about climate refugees, you know, how do we define those? So if you go ahead and actually populate that one, we're going to hear, while you're putting your answers in, from our final speakers, Alison and Richard, who are going to cover our final element today, which is about life on our Earth. So I'm going to pass over to you, Richard and Alison.
Thank you, Hazel. So yes, we're going to focus now on life on Earth. And thanks so much, Aravind and Michelle, for everything you've covered so far, and we'll pick up on some of those. And this question of stickiness, human stickiness, is this idea of why stay in place? You know, what are the threats to you and around your perception of security that are so important? And when we think of human security, we think about personal and community security. Michelle's just touched upon land and conflict between communities as a security threat. But there's also elements around political security, economic, health, food, and environmental security. So I wanted to take you to Afghanistan, a place that's been very much in the news recently. And if we reflect then again on these elements of security, what's going on within this country, when you start thinking about land and conflict between communities, the political instability with the Taliban takeover, the collapse in jobs, the rapid increase in food prices from an economic security perspective, COVID, polio, failing health services, a drought impacting food security, all leading into this broader environmental challenge. And what's hitting Afghanistan yet again in 2021 is another drought, which follows on from multiple years of drought that have impacted the country, not simultaneously, but these are repeat patterns. And the map we're showing you at the moment is areas in orange that have been particularly badly affected by drought in the first cycle of this year. That's very much the winter cycle, planted late last year, harvested in spring this year, where those most severely impacted are orange and red, and they're mostly up here in the north. But it's also important to understand that there are other areas of agricultural productivity in that country, which are shown in orange, not orange, grey, in these areas, which were no change to the longer term average in terms of agricultural productivity. And what we have really is a north-south divide. There's two stories really going on in terms of mechanisms to cope in the face of drought. And so what I wanted to do first is go south to this area in southern Afghanistan, to Helmand, and I'll talk you through this video. Whereas we zoom in, you can see this dark green area. These are the reliable, irrigated agricultural areas of decades of production. But because of conflict, populations moved into this desert space here. And as we zoom in further and further, we can now come into the community level and now household level to look at how communities and households are arranged in these desert spaces. And we can see here, we've got domestic compounds here and here. We have the fields laid out here, and we have these black squares, which are solar panels. And these are linked to pumps, which are linked to tube wells that are going down to the aquifers underground, which are then pumping water into these reservoirs here, 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 which are then irrigating the crops that you can then see. And we can see that over time, the agricultural expansion shown in this map shows the degree to which these communities have moved into this desert spaces, have settled their land, cleared it, built houses, built compound walls, and started to grow their crops. And much of it's a coping mechanism to escape the violence of that dark blue area that was typically called the green zone and the focus of much of the fighting in that area. But at the household level, what we have is communities that are in a really desperate situation. Many of them depend on growing opium in order to pay their costs of establishment. And we can see at the household level here, construction of a house, the perimeter walls, the irrigation systems, the cropping systems, and they've got scant other assets at the household level to help them carry through what is a really harsh and challenging life in the desert. But what's happening in many cases is that the household level, they're adopting these solar panels I pointed to in the imagery just now. And you can see how that's then linked to the pump, to then the water reservoirs, and then into the irrigation systems of the fields you can see in the areas behind the panels. And this is counterintuitive that you'd be able to grow such lush, vibrant crops in such a desert area. And so we've spent some time looking at the adoption of this solar panel green technology in these desert spaces. And this map shows how over time, the number of reservoirs we can see in the imagery has grown from nothing before 2016 up to 67,000 in 2019. And, you know, over the last couple of years, that's increased ever since, which is a remarkable scale of adoption. And it's how these communities have been able to stay in place in this area of the desert in the face of quite a dramatic drought. And had they not had this access, they would be severely impacted by the drought this year. But what we have with this area is this triple nexus of human insecurity, where they've avoided the fighting by moving into the desert, drilling so they can pump water, where in order to recoup the costs, they're now growing 90% of their crop with opium popping. But yet they're drawing on the underground aquifers at a fundamentally unsustainable level, where environmentally these are expected to collapse at some point in the future, which will then drive over 1 million people away from this space as and when that happens. So whilst they're secure for the moment and in the short term, their agricultural systems, are showing, you know, normal levels of productivity, that's not secure going forward, and we need to monitor that space as we go forward. So then if we move up to the north, what we have here is a different situation. And this is a video from some internally displaced settlements that were points of concentration of people displaced as a consequence of the drought that occurred in this area in 2018, and very similar pattern of drought impact in this year, 2021. These communities normally have reliable agricultural systems like we've seen in the south, where on a normal year, they're able to grow crops reliably and predictably. What they don't have is when they are hit by a severe drought year, the ability to carry themselves through by staying in place because they've got a diverse income streams of perhaps other on-farm agricultural activities or off-farm income earning opportunities and other coping mechanisms. They simply don't have it. And when they lose their crops, they lose their agricultural productivity, they're forced off the land. And life in these camps can be really harsh, as I'm sure you've seen here and in other internally displaced camps, especially when their movement is precipitated by such challenges that are brought on through these rapid onset events. And of course, as we hit the winter now, those in these IDP camps are going to be facing increasingly challenged temperatures and weather events. So what we were asked to do by a client, by an NGO client called the Norwegian Refugee Council, was to look from imagery to see if we could see their beneficiary tents from space, which is very clear from this imagery we're showing you here. And our challenge was to see whether we could develop some artificial intelligence and some algorithms by which we could then automatically extract the points of the locations of tents so that we can do tent counts over time. And we spent some time looking around at different mechanisms, different models to do this. We followed various, but the deep learning model that we subsequently developed came out with some very high levels of accuracy. So we had an average precision of 97% and a 99% sensitivity rate to get a final output map of the location of tents at a really accurate way. And so when that came to the wider area mapping, we were then able to run the algorithm across the imagery and map and identify all of the tents that were the beneficiary tents of this particular client of the Norwegian Refugee Council. And you can see from this map how dispersed these tents are across space, but equally, they're not equally dispersed. We have lots of different variations in the numbers of tents and the numbers of population groups, and they've all not come from the same location, which is something we'll return to in the moment, in my second part. But for now, what I'm going to do is hand you over to Alison, who's going to take you to another part of the world. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks, Richard. Hello, everyone. I've been traveling to northern Uganda since 2008, and I've made at least 2 trips a year until COVID stopped us all from going anywhere. And I've seen for myself how weather patterns are changing and the devastating impact that this is having on communities. And it's driving people away from their homes and their villages just to find a better life or any life. And the seasons are changing, and the farmers can't plan or predict the best time to plant their seeds. So when it should rain, it's hot and dry. When the sun should be ripening the crops, the rains come and they just wash everything away, resulting in failed crops and no food. But the reason I first visited an IDP camp back in 2008 wasn't because of climate change, but because of conflict. And in northern Uganda, there was a war between the government's army and the rebel group, the Lord's Resistance Army, and it lasted for 20 years, from 1986 to 2006. It was brutal, and thousands of adults and children were abducted and killed. And it also forced up to 2 million people into huge IDP camps, and some people were in these camps for up to 20 years. The Acholi people of northern Uganda, they live very simple lives and rely on subsistence farming for their livelihoods. They're very poor and extremely vulnerable to outside shocks. They live in simple mud huts with no power or water, and their nearest neighbour can be up to a mile away, And that's how they like it. The bigger the family, the more huts you'll find in a compound. And it's an outdoor life, just going inside to sleep, cook, and shelter from the rain. So can you imagine what it must be like to be crammed into camps like this? Each hut housed a family, and they slept and cooked in just that one hut. There was no sanitation and very little clean water. And the risk of fire was huge. And you can see if one hut caught fire, then they'd all catch fire. And sometimes the camps were torched by the rebels. And they were locked in, unable to leave the camp or go home for years. And this is a map. I know we've been seeing lots of very high-tech solutions and things and maps, but this is a map that they drew in one of the camps, a camp called Olwal, and every dot represents a hut. So you can see just how crammed in they all were. And for the men, it was terrible. They had nothing to do. So if they tried to leave the camp and were caught by the rebels, they'd be abducted or murdered. And if they were caught by the army, they were arrested or shot. All they could do was sit and wait. And they started drinking really heavily, and their frustrations and anger were taken out on the women. The women and the girls were all at the mercy of the men. And I met these women who were all single parents. Their husbands had either been murdered or abducted, or they'd been raped by the rebels or soldiers who were sent to protect them in the camp. And as there was no family planning, the women, they all fell pregnant. So the camps were full of children also hanging around with absolutely nothing to do. And these children have now grown up, but they've had no formal education, and they were deprived of the cultural and traditional skills which were passed from one generation to another. And now in South Sudan, floods and conflict are driving people over the border into northern Uganda. And Uganda hosts more than 1.5 million refugees, with more than 60 of them coming from South Sudan. And what happens is they gather at the border, and then they're taken by bus to different camps. And a few years ago, I visited a couple of these camps. When they arrive, they're registered, and then they spend a few days sleeping in tents before being assigned a tiny plot of land, like you can see here. Then with a blanket, a sleeping mat, and a couple of pots and maybe a few other things given to them, they build these small huts and they try and grow vegetables to survive. And the camps are split into zones. And I met a woman who was in a zone of 4,500 people, and they have to segregate them because of all of the tribal differences. So it's quite complex how they're structured. There's not enough food, and they struggle to find seeds and tools to farm. So this as well puts huge pressure on the host communities because they're coping with the changing climate while still trying to rebuild their lives more than 10 years since they themselves left the IDP camps. So a little insight into life in the camp. And back to Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Alison, for that, and an incredible insights into dynamics in northern Uganda, but a salient reminder that life in IDP camps, the drivers for why people arrive in them are from a number of these different shocks and their abilities to either remain in place, or when that fails, or when choice is removed, they find themselves arriving in these locations.
Thank you,
So,
Richard. Richard, before
yes.
you move on, do you mind if let me just nip back to the Mentimeter, if I may?
Exactly.
Because we asked a question, didn't we, about how would you describe a climate refugee? And interestingly, if we look at, I'm trying to look at our poll because the writing is very small and my eyes are very old. People affected by slow-moving climate events is the highest that we have there, followed by anyone who self-identifies as a climate refugee, and then Indigenous people. So that's really interesting that actually, we're looking at here the responses from our participants, and thank you so much for actually participating in this, that the climate refugee is, for the audience that's with us today, thinking about that as people that are affected by climate change over a longer period of time as the one that they associate with being a climate refugee. So before we go back to Richard, I'm going to ask you your third and final question. We've heard some really compelling stories there from Alison about, what she's actually witnessed and the sorts of lives and the stories of the people that end up in the refugee camps. So I guess my final question to you is, if you were faced with life in one of these camps, what would you prefer to do? Would you prefer to continue on your migration journey to find somewhere that's more secure for your future? Or would you like the choice of being able to return home to where you call home and re-establish your roots there? So just if we can go, Anita, to that last question, we'll see what sort of responses we actually get from our audience on there in terms of what would you prefer to do? Migrate to a more secure area or want to return home? Okay, so it's an interesting one that we're almost the same, but actually at the moment what we're seeing, Richard, is that people would prefer to migrate to a more secure area, and now we're 50-50. Look at that. And it goes up and down like a yo-yo. Well, let's go back to you, Richard, and let's talk about the case of returning home if we can.
Thanks, Hazel. Yeah, exactly. So imagine now you're in an IDP camp be it anywhere. Faced with these different aspects of human security that we've discussed, and in particular environmental impacts on what has led you to being there. And you've been considering that in that Mentee question just now. So this example is playing out in Afghanistan right now across tens of millions of people in this country who are trying to work out, do I go or do I stay? And when I say go, that's out migration. So migration is when you leave your country as opposed to being internally displaced, which has brought you to the camps in the first place. So let's have a look at what's going on in Afghanistan right now. Here's a video that was taken a couple of weeks ago. These are pickup trucks loaded typically with 22 people. You pay more to sit in the cabs up front, and they are at a Taliban checkpoint waiting to make their payments before they head off to the border with Pakistan. As you can imagine, from here, you've got long queues of people, all quite desperate to leave. And what we were able to do was map the location of the Taliban checkpoint, which was here, which was on the convergence of the main road running south from the provincial capital, and this road here as a side road, where the canal here canalized the movement all to pass through their checkpoint just here. But because it was a new administration and they changed the rules from the previous government, people were not so clear on how and where they had to make their different payments. The Taliban had simplified it to one payment, but they weren't quite clear on the process. So as a consequence of all this, you can see here, we've got some geo-referenced video here, which is showing at this location, queues stretching back 4 wide, and then back at these points, queues now 2 wide, going back over 1 kilometer. Showing the scale of the tailbacks that were trying to pass the checkpoint. And then this bottom image shows you these vehicles now zooming off into the desert. And this is the provincial capital they're coming from, Zaranj. And the red route is the old route they used to follow here before they crossed an occasional, mostly river system that they have to cross in ferries, following this yellow route into Pakistan before they head into Iran. And this red route's all desert and quite slow going. But they had to take that because when the previous government, before the Taliban takeover, they couldn't go along the main roads, which is here. But with the fall of that government and the Taliban now in place, they can now follow this yellow road. And it's dramatically sped up the time it takes them to drive from Zaranj to this place called Bak in Pakistan, where they get off their vehicles and drivers from Pakistan drive them the next leg of the journey. And before the Taliban takeover in the winter, there were about 100 of those vehicles leaving Zaranj up here every day. In the summer months, it was about 200. Then as we were starting to see the encroachment of the Taliban in April and May this year, those numbers increased from 200 to 300 to 400. With the Taliban takeover, it went to over 450, 500 vehicles a day. 500 vehicles a day equates to 11,000 people leaving that country along this route. About 10 days ago, there were 60,000 people left in 3 days. There were that many vehicles leaving. And that was because the buildup in Zaranj and the population who come to Zaranj arrived in a surge, and there weren't enough vehicles to physically move that many people out of Zaranj into Pakistan as quickly as people in Zaranj wanted. So we've been trying to track this surge of vehicles and people through imagery as we go. And I just wanted to illustrate a bit of a challenge here, because normally when you take satellite imagery here, it's taken at midday, it's sun synchronous. So it's a midday imagery collection. You can see the Taliban checkpoint and not much activity at midday. But what we know is that because of the heat, people don't leave Zaranj till about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, with the idea of getting down to Dak, typically anywhere between, at sunset, so anywhere between 5 and 7 p.m. now. And so if you try and look at these places on normal satellite imagery, you're not going to see them. And this is an example of working with Planet, who, as well as having sun synchronous satellite imagery capability, they've also got non-sun synchronous. And so we can see this image of Dak here, which is taken at 3:42 local time in the afternoon. So not late enough to see the surge of vehicles arrive. We can see some pickups are here, but these are more the ones providing logistical support here at Dak. But you can imagine that come 5 to 7 p.m., you'd see about 500 of these pickups all in this, milling around this area, dropping people off, and then more drivers from Pakistan picking them up and then taking them off to take the second part of their journey up here to the Mashkal Mountains. At this location, they need to get off because the vehicles can't pass, and they walk it. And this is a video of these mostly working age male men leaving their country in the sort of numbers that we're talking about here. Before the Taliban takeover, there were a lot of families that were going as well. But with the takeover by the Taliban, about a third of them were former Afghan National Army, Afghan National Police, seeking to leave the country before persecutions, recriminations could be meted out on them. So that's the story of people who are going now. And like I said, there's of the order of more than 10,000 people a day leaving on just that single route from Afghanistan. But going back to the IDP camps, going back to the point before you go to Zaranj, before you pay to get on those vehicles to take you out of country, let's imagine now you're thinking through the idea of, well, okay, what if I stay? Could I stay? Could I actually leave this IDP camp and go home? And there's this need for this examination of the conditions of those home communities that these IDPs have come from, to examine those, to look at what are the environmental and wider security impacts that have driven these households and communities off their land, from their homes into the IDP camps, to see what could be done to try and help them make that choice to return back to their home communities. And so what we did for the Norwegian Refugee Council as a second part to that tent mapping exercise I showed you earlier was to look in more context at these community situations. And so through the development of 3 separate products, which I'll describe, we were able to merge them together into a model to look at which areas could be those that could be identified for working on to implement programs to encourage people to return to. So the first factor was about drought impact. So where had the drought impacted hardest and most significantly? And in this area, we're looking at those that were in the red, and in particular, these areas up here in Gormak and Murgab, but there were some other areas here as well. We're also looking then at population density to look at the carrying capacity of the agriculture, the agricultural systems, the food production systems, to examine what the carrying capacity of that agriculture would be to the amount of people dependent on it at the local level. And this is one of the points I'll wrap up with in the summary, which is this need to go micro with our data. We can see communities and households from space. The data is available and we can do that. And in this case, we've mapped every domestic compound across Afghanistan to allow us to go to the household level and then do more accurate population density maps that we're illustrating here. And then the third is a potential livelihoods model, which is to look at, let's bring together population density, agricultural productivity, access to markets, access to government services, education, health, development programs, access to finance, access to development programming that until the Taliban took over was quite prolific in various locations. Lights at night as a proxy for economic growth. And you can see that there's a series of different data layers we can merge together here, where in this case, those areas that are most purple are those who've got the greatest potential livelihoods. And then we're able to bring that together in a 3-dimensional model, looking at those 3 parameters about drought, population density, and livelihoods, where we're looking here for those colors that are mostly these dark purples and which are tallest. So we're looking for height and this color intensity. And so from this, we're able to provide this data back to NRC to say to them, look, these areas here, in particular here, and these areas here, will be some really important areas for you to think about where you might begin to go and do some field work, to go and ground truth this information that's all derived from space, to make sure that A, it's accurate, B, that it's relevant, but importantly then how you might be able to develop some programming to support what you might then do. And then this is a tweet that was posted by Will from NRC, who's in one of these locations that we've marked as one of the high priority areas to go and visit. And if you see right at the bottom of his text there, he's talking about their construction of a water reservoir here. It's going to help 3,000 people with access to safe water for their livelihoods, their livestock, but importantly, to allow for over 1,000 people to return to those locations. And that ability for us to provide an operational organization like the NRC with data like that to help them plan exactly where they're going to do their field surveys, to assess the needs, and then construct targeted, focused interventions is about creating those sorts of efficiencies on the ground that are really effective. So just to wrap up then, I think my pleas here to you as the group would be the data exists for us to do this community level risk and vulnerability mapping. It's there. Space-based data from a range of different sensors is available, but our methods, our mechanisms for drawing on them at this hyper-local level are not well developed. But without it, we can't create this focused, targeted support to these communities to understand their stickiness factor, what's keeping them in place, like we saw down in the south of Afghanistan. But without it, nor can we look to explore how we can empower people in IDP camps with greater choice and their opportunities then to return to their original homes. And therefore, space-based data can provide that high-resolution data. And it's not just spatial resolution, we're talking temporal as well, to examine change over time, to explore those drivers. But equally, this business of being able to turn around analysis rapidly and deploy them on platforms so that dispersed teams in remote areas can access and visualize and plan from. And as a consequence, the impact of this support is that our clients, donors, beneficiary communities get a much better understanding of these challenges, more effective decisions can be made, and better outcomes achieved from those who are most severely impacted by these developing environmental challenges. Thank you. Over to you, Hazel.
Richard, many thanks for that, and a great presentation to finish on. Just to let you know, I know some of you struggled to access the Mentimeter. It is still open, and the details of the Menti are in the chat box. If you'd like to complete it, you know, we'd be happy to see that. And also, our Q&A box could do with a little bit of fattening up as well. So if you want to put some questions in there for our panel members, that would be absolutely amazing. Now, I just want to go to, you know, a couple of the questions that we've had, and I'm going to address this one to you, Alison, if I may. The question is, other than fundraising and raising awareness, are there any specific initiative organisations and individuals working in social impact to support individuals affected by climate change more effectively?
Ooh. Yes, in a nutshell, I would say, if my interpretation of the question is people actually supporting the people who need it rather than just raising money to support other people. So Seeds for Development, that's exactly what we do, and we reach out and work, but we're very, very localized, back to Richard's point of down at the community level. So there are local organizations in Uganda, and a lot of the focus is on climate smart agriculture. So there is, for example, a fantastic NGO called Trees for the Future, and they go and work with farmers to build, they're called forest gardens, and it's brilliant. So it's all about planting trees, enriching the soil, supporting the farmers, and teaching them multiple uses for the trees. They can be windbreaks, they can feed the soil. So it's all very organic, and then grow the vegetables amongst the trees. So they're a really, really great organization. Practical Action here in the UK, they're very good as well. They're very practical solutions that people can do. The clue's in the name. And so, yes, they can be found. I can certainly help connect. If you'd like to be connected to any of them, please do feel free to get in touch. But it's all about empowering that local community and teaching them. And the farmers that we work with, they don't have smartphones. So apps are great for the people who are supporting them to be able to go on the ground and educate them, but they would never yet, not I think in our generation, use them for farming and to be able to plan and predict. But there are organisations out there.
That's brilliant. I'm going to ask our other speakers not to be shy. Let's see your faces again. Aravind, I'm going to come to you. So Alison's just made the point there that a lot of the people that you've worked with in the past don't have access to mobile phones. So when we're talking about, you know, what you've been working on with Tomorrow Aya, how can we get that data into the hands of those that Alison's worked with in terms who don't necessarily have access to mobile phones? Is there another way that we can look at addressing that challenge?
Sure, I think it's essentially a communication challenge. You know, how do we get the information? You know, well, if we just think about how we used to do it ourselves, like 20, 30 years before, you know, we used to pass the information by other means of communication. We have radio, television, and if we don't have access to any of that, then it's essentially just, you know, going onto the field and installing communication devices that can then, you know, disseminate the message to a group. So if we don't have access to mobile phones, you know, this can be done. But then what we are seeing is that the adoption of mobile phones is increasing and it's only growing over time. So if you were to bet on something and have that as a strategy, and that's kind of what we think, and that's also what the data has shown, is that the adoption of mobile phones is increasing everywhere in Africa, and it's just growing at such a rapid rate. And not only in terms of just using mobile phones, but the way they use mobile phones is very, very different to how we use mobile phones. So if you were to, our farmers here in the West are not very used to receiving mobile alerts on a daily basis in order to know when to, how to plan for fertilizing their crops. This is something we need to adapt to as well. But then just like how payments were adopted on mobile very easily in Africa, there is a very good chance that intelligence, or weather intelligence in our case, that we need to pass on, it can be passed on very easily. And we see that results from the Locust project that I was mentioning. How do you pass the information, and people who can afford to have mobile phones and internet connectivity there, we are passing the message on through WhatsApp messages today. And that's not something that we would do in the West, but then that's something that we need to develop locally, or localized solutions for Africa.
Alison.
I think you're absolutely right. And just before this session, I sent some money to somebody, a farmer, who doesn't have a smartphone, just using his old-fashioned phone, because he was in hospital and he had to have an X-ray and he didn't have any money. So we could transfer the money. So whilst I was just finishing off prepping for this, we were able to send that money. So if we could educate them and move it so that this information could be presented in a way like money for them that they could access immediately, then I think that would be a golden nugget for someone to develop. And education and communication, you're right.
Fantastic, thank you, Alison. Michelle, I want to sort of look at the case study that you presented to us with the Indigenous people and talk about Aravin's kind of almost, what did you call it, last mile, right? So getting that information into the hands, that weather information into the hands of the people. So you've obviously seen the impact of extreme flooding, and I don't know what the mobile phone situation is, but can you see something like Aravin's product that he's developed and the geospatial data available actually supporting the communities that you've worked with?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things, though, that I'd like to, like Arvin mentioned, cell phones is almost widespread now, especially even in Indigenous and local communities. And they're actually using it in different ways to gather information, to also spread messages. But I think there's a point as well, is that they themselves are like scientists and they're collecting the data themselves. So they know, they have this local knowledge. And I think oftentimes we forget that these people are on the ground, they have this information, and it's how to utilize this information as well, so that we can, make it at a larger scale, at a broader scale, so we can see patterns. And we shouldn't forget that aspect of it, because I think that needs to be inputted as well. It's not just, we learning, they learning from us, but it's also we learning from them, because they have this sort of knowledge on the ground as to how to implement whatever information that we give them, and or how they can help adapt whatever technology as well that they are using on the ground. I can see it going both ways, because some of the communities that we've worked with, they've actually used some of this data to map, for example, fire loads, where the most fire-prone trees are occurring within their communities. And then that can give them a sense as to where they can expect a lot of droughts coming for the next several years, or where there's lowlands, or where there's, high water table that may be occurring. So you can see the application as well, but they also have that knowledge as to knowing their lands and sort of mapping it out also. So you can, I think both sides of the perspective is very important here.
So Arvin, come back to you then. So we're talking about that local tacit knowledge that people have and the geospatial data, and one of the things that Richard made quite clear is actually taking all of these data sources and bringing them all together to give us, better information. Any ideas about how we might do that more effectively?
Yeah, essentially, I think that's what I focused on in terms of intelligence. And the need to provide actionable insights, whoever uses the data or the information or the insight, they don't really care or understand how this gets to them. All they need to know is, if it's a farmer, when do I water my crops, or, when do I plan for my fertilizers, if I have to worry about when. So essentially it's about, getting it down to the detail of the passing on the information. So, we talked about mobile as one of the means, and another mean is an alert, like Alison was mentioning earlier about, it as long as they get a message, that can help them at, if it's going to be a flood alert, or, if it's just about, not even wanting to download an application because they don't have internet access, so they can't get real-time alerts. If it's just about sending alerts via SMS or a messaging service, whatever messaging service they might use, that's one way to think about it. But then there's also the perspective of how we are going to communicate it, right? Like in our case, we want to just, get the message down to very, very simple detail. So, we're investing a lot in, I broke it down into three: the observation, the modeling, and then the insight. Even if we have to, dial down the technology or the technicality with respect to what kind of observation it is or how the modeling was done, the thing that they worry about is the insight. That is the final point, and how that affects them. And that is basically what I think we have to learn over the next few years in order to communicate that better, because it's not, next year they're not going to have the ability to download mobile apps so that we can send them real-time alerts. Next year, they're not definitely going to have infrastructure or laptops within their house so that they can just log on and see a map if you were to, do that dynamically. So we have to plan for this, at least in this decade, as we adapt to the changing climate, about how we're going to communicate this final message and how we can do it in a way that works for them, whoever the audience is, whatever sector they might be involved in, if it's a government, if it's the military, if it's the farmer. It's about, getting the information adapted in a way that they can understand and get actionable insight. If not, whatever investment and innovation that we might make in space to, get the satellite imagery, get better version of the satellite imagery or a higher resolution of satellite imagery, or in our case in weather, even if we were to improve accuracy of weather, where we were able to predict something to 100%, if you're not able to pass that information on, none of those really matter, right?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I guess what we're trying to do with the information that we're using in our geospatial data is to present that to the audience, whoever that audience might be, an indigenous population. It might be somebody in a refugee camp that, that Alison's met, that's trying to grow the crops to sustain their families. It might be the NGOs, it might be governments. How do we actually think about the way that we're going to present that data that gives people the information that they kind of need at that moment in time, but not too much detail that it all becomes overwhelming and people turn away from it? Any thoughts on that?
Was that to me as well?
Well, you know what? I just sort of slung it open without pointing in anybody's direction, didn't I? Really, which is a bit naughty. So let's go around. Let's go around the room. Yeah, Aravind, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Michelle, Richard, and Alison.
Sure. Well, it's a question of how we want to do that. For example, in our case, obviously we need to learn from someone locally. If it's about passing the information on in a way that they would understand, we cannot make assumptions about how they would understand these and what they would require. So in our case, I mentioned our nonprofit, and we're going to have detailed presentation on Friday about how we do that with our partners in Africa. We work with them in order to understand what is the best way that they would need this alert, because what can be assumed is this information is valuable to them, but what cannot be assumed is this is the way this information is useful to them, right? Like that has almost become sometimes arrogant if you were to assume that this is the information and this is what is going to be useful, and you just stand there waiting because that information is not being used. That's the wrong way to go about it. So the right way to go about it is to find local partners, people who work, because there are going to be people from, it can be the government, it can be local NGOs, it can be local startups really, who are ready to partner with you and help you understand what's the best way you can get the message across. So that's basically the thing, like collaborating with someone who is out there, because just like we saw with the mobile payment example, we would have never known that we can send message through through a messaging service, because we don't do that. We would have just assumed that we need to develop the internet infrastructure, give computers everyone. But then what happened over there was completely different, right? Like the mobile payment picked up, and we wouldn't expect. And the same thing applies here as well. There's going to be some localized innovation that's going to develop, and we're going to have to partner locally with people over there, organizations over there, nonprofits over there, in order to make that happen.
Brilliant, thanks. Michelle, your perspective on that?
I agree with what Arvind said. I think it's important to look at the local perspective and how they want to use the data and what is the end products that they want. We've worked with not just like indigenous communities, but also government agencies and NGOs historically, and they have an objective as to what and how they want to use this data. And I think it's working with them to see how that develops. And they may have, as Arvind said, ideas as well on how to communicate it, but also to adapt whatever geospatial data is there, so then it can be produced at a wider level, whether it's for public consumption or even for policymakers. I think working with local persons or individuals or even communities is sort of very key here. So I think you touched on that pretty well. Brilliant,
thanks. Richard, your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a huge opportunity here. I think the space I've described in terms of Afghanistan, and an area I know particularly well, is typically a top-down model of donor support in these fragile, conflict-affected states and regions and areas. Development donor assistance comes down basically from needs assessments and distributed that way. There hasn't to date in the Afghan context been a huge amount of effort invested in these sorts of bottom-up means of communications. So whilst there's been, let's say, the distribution of price data to communities in terms of agricultural products to help them choose what they might plant, that's been pretty hit and miss. There's been some domestic abuse reporting hotlines, but again, underinvested. But I think the real opportunity here is, if it is that communities knew what it was the people who wanted to help them needed to know, then that sort of two-way communication could work very effectively. So for instance, with connected communities who've got smartphones, if they knew that we wanted to know what the level of the water was in the local reservoir, or how deep their tube well, the water drop in their tube well was on a daily basis, let's say, and it's no effort for them to collect that and send it in, then why wouldn't they? But these sorts of mechanisms and methods, because they tie into the space-based data methodologies, are not as well developed as they could be. So there is a big opportunity to develop these more effectively.
So this kind of so Alison, if I come over to you, so do you think there's an education piece here then that needs to be explored?
I think it's a huge education piece, because people in countries such as Uganda, they don't know what they don't know. And so I've been working for Richard at Alcis for the last couple of years. I've spent decades working in tech for big technology companies. I had no idea that this was all there and what you could do and the power of the map. And we as in non-technical, non-geo people, we all use Google Maps. And to suddenly realize that the power and the art of the possible. So there are so many people who don't realize what they can do. So I think there's a huge education point to NGOs here, the big ones and the little ones like us, but also to facilitate and enable and empower them to go to the country, to the ministries, to people, because data is also very sensitive, isn't it, about different data sets. So the educating sort of governments and people that they can then feel empowered to know. But a lot of people, I think, would be quite scared because of being ignorant and not knowing, and they wouldn't want to show their ignorance. So yes, I think education and communication is key to all of the points that everyone's made.
Thank you, thank you. Richard, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to talk about, you made mention of temporal data, and then you actually talked about aquifers, those underground water sources that we actually know that, that are pumping water to support the agriculture areas that you actually mentioned. Now, I'm always quite interested in those because I know there's lots of work going on. I know NASA are doing some work on that one in terms of the depletion of aquifers, across the world and the potential impact that that's going to have. So I guess you were talking about, was it 67,000 reservoirs in 2019, and these are going up? Are you starting to look at modeling the data to see, potentially how, or, merging this data with other geospatial data to look at the depletion of these aquifers and how long realistically that those that are supported by this underground water source are going to be able to be sustaining that sort of level of draw?
Exactly, brilliant. Yes, we've written and published on this, and so there's online research on that. So I can offer in reports to anybody who's listening who wants more detail on this. But yeah, there is real fragility here, and the question is not if, it's when those aquifers dry up, and those people are then forced to move. And we're talking, at least 1.5 million people in those desert spaces that will now lose their agricultural systems and be forced to move. So when will that happen? And we've been asking donors to invest in this area to generate a better mechanism for early warning on this. But with the Taliban takeover, there's been this hiatus in terms of this level of interest. But space-based data, in terms of its ability to map subterranean aquifers, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think it's a challenging space. A more operational solution would be for us to come back to that point about daily dipping of tube wells. So some of these ones in the desert spaces are 100, 200 meters deep. But if they're having to drill deeper and deeper and deeper, that's an indicator. But if they're able to do some dipping for drops on a more regular, systematic way across an area, we can get those levels and record how those might change over time, then that would be another indicator. But in the absence of that, because now donor support to Afghanistan is very much humanitarian focused and is not going to be looking at this area, the solution imagery can provide is to look at the water in the reservoirs. And that is the key indicator. If we no longer see water in certain reservoirs, then those are failing. And the areas to look at would be those of relative higher elevation in those desert spaces who've got to dig deeper to get to the aquifers than the lower lying ones. And so 3D, very detailed 3D data is important to this, which fortunately we hold. And so we're working in the background to try and model this and see whether we can develop an indicators and warnings mechanism for this really fragile community.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Richard. Michelle, I want to come back to you because we're switching from, areas of drought to what you're seeing, which is areas of flooding. And I'm interested to learn from you how you said people are moving to other areas. I'm interested to learn how else things have actually changed for them, to be able to cope with the, the rising water levels and the damage to crops. Have you got some examples of what you've seen change to accommodate the changes in weather conditions?
So I think there's a couple of things that I've seen a lot of communities do. And I think this is where, they've had experience, for example, especially the elders, maybe 20, 30 years ago, and they're remembering back what they did previously, just because of the frequency of either the droughts or the flooding that are occurring. So they're testing even like the variants of cassava, the different types of cassava, and seeing what works where. And then they're also testing what types of other crops that can be planted within their areas so that they can help with, buffering the soil with more nutrients, for instance. So, these agroforestry sort of techniques, or even shade cropping. So there's different type of techniques that they themselves are testing out. And I think that's important because oftentimes, and I think Richard mentioned this, is that we always have this idea of top-down sort of information. But in fact, there's a whole other level of information that's occurring at the ground level that sometimes we're not even picking up because it's not very well known, or it's not being shared as widely as it could. But they themselves are testing out the farmers, whether it tends to be very familial in certain areas rather than village, because it depends on the community dynamics. So they themselves are testing out or experimenting with different types of crops, with different techniques, with different ways of farming. And oftentimes we don't pick up on that because it's going from the bottom up. And I think that sort of innovation is important because we sometimes miss it. And this is where, going back, it's looking at what local people is doing, communicating with them, working with them, and having that sort of two-way dynamic that Richard and even Arvind and Alison also mentioned. It's having that open communication as to what's being done on the ground, but also how they can get data in where and when they need it.
Thank you. And Alison, from the work that you've done, have you seen that innovation, with people, that have actually had to move and migrate and actually trying to maybe grow? You talked about the challenges of trying to grow their own food and things like that. Are you seeing innovation in those areas as well to allow for some food security?
Yes, they are. They're so innovative. They might not have any money or anything, but the fact that they survived so long under such conditions, and the intercropping and how they intercrop, and that I was saying in the camps, they lost that intergenerational knowledge transfer. And so there's new technology coming in that people are learning when they go to school or they go to university, and they come back to the villages and they're educating. But I think I see just how they know how to plant the different varieties of crops that they are growing, and they just know because it's been passed down. The same for medicines and when they're sick and what they use in the local cures and things like that. So yes, I think innovation is something they do incredibly well, and they have to survive.
Yeah, thanks. Aravind, I don't know whether you've been seeing the impact of innovation through people that have had your early weather warning systems in place. Are you noticing a change there?
You mean a change in terms of how they're starting to, work from what they're receiving? Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of, for example, if you take the locust example again, earlier, the status quo was they did not receive anything, and it turned out to be a surprise when there were locust swarms that they just go out and face every day. But then having this a few days or at least even a day in advance, because this discussion is, it's a different discussion about what really causes locusts and can we really predict that. And there are some meteorological factors involved, whether it's precipitation or wind. And based on that, when we give them, the forecast for whether it's locusts or not, the actions that they're going to take, we can see the impact on the actions. They're able to plan better. I mentioned the crop fertilizer example, and people who are even harvesting, they can go ahead and get that planned out at least one or 2 days in advance. And with more satellites up there, especially with what we're launching in the next starting next year, there's going to be increased likelihood of them getting these warnings well ahead in advance, and not only for the case of locusts, but also in terms of flood alerts that people can receive, and also governments can receive, so that they can plan. So it applies to any type of audience, right? Like I've just focused on farmers as an example, but then it's also the same case for the governments. Going back to an example in the West, people were just not ready. The communication with respect to how Hurricane Ada was felt in New York. There was a lot of discussion when it happened. Even in in the United States, how can people be so not ready in terms of getting even after getting these alerts? So there is need for innovation also in the West about how we're going to pass the information on. Clearly sending a forecast of there's going to be flash floods, it's not doing much. So we need to even change the way we communicate. What can be more actionable, whether it's a government who wants to plan it well in advance, or whether it's an individual or it's a company. You know, if they want to plan, if it's an airline company, if it's an energy company, it's all part of the whole, you know, it all fits into the climate discussion, simply because climate, you know, it's not just you know, humanitarian, but also economic, right? So how can we go ahead and reduce these economic damages that we're going to cause because of climate change, or what's going to happen in this decade as extreme weather events rise? How are we going to plan that as businesses, as individuals, and also governments? So there's scope to innovate everywhere there.
And you're right, sort of, you do look at us, don't you, in the Western world, and think actually we should be able to cope. We have the, you know, disaster planning and emergency preparedness, and yet we've seen, you know, from the news reports that the Western world is equally as affected by these, you know, fires and floods and so on that we're actually seeing, and we're not coping perhaps as well as we should have done. So Richard, you spoke about, you know, one of the sort of concluding remarks that you made in your presentation was about drawing on this data, right? We know there's an awful lot of data out there and available, you know, but I'm interested in, so, okay, there's the data there, and we've heard today that we can use some of this data to help us, you know, secure the safety of individuals across the world. But where does the responsibility sit, and, you know, to actually pull all of that data together and share that data? And I'm just interested in your views about, you know, some good practice or some guidance about, you know, how we can do this and how we can start to champion that cause.
So brilliant. I mean, this is at the heart of the response to bringing support to communities, and typically it starts with a needs assessment. These would be done subnationally at areas that are affected by whatever the phenomenon might be, a drought, or a flood, or fire, or environmental event, or frankly other types of shocks that communities are facing. And the United Nations typically lead on these things, as they typically lead on the humanitarian response to these sorts of challenges. And they've got a well-practiced, well-developed needs assessment, needs overview process that they go to. I think the opportunity now, with the evolving systems in space and the increased availability of mobile phone proliferation across these affected communities, is to really deepen the data that's gathered and analysed in a more systematic way. Often these responding organisations, they'll have a range of NGO partners who will go out and ask a bunch of questions, which are all very important to get that information from the ground. But a lot of the responses are sort of relative, you know, so how badly have you been affected this year? And they'll say, well, I'm really badly affected. I've lost all my crops. Well, okay, if you've got two communities who both lost their crops this year, well, what's their typical baseline for agricultural success? Because if one typically succeeds and one typically doesn't, that one that doesn't will have alternative coping mechanisms in place, will be more resilient to drought when it hits them, versus those that typically get a crop who won't have those. And therefore, arguably, although might be financially, economically better off, actually when they are hit by a drought, it has devastating consequences that forces them to dislocate. So this is my plea, which is to say, can we use higher resolutions of data, not just space-based, but also data from the ground, in terms of these new technologies that you can run from mobile phones, in terms of video, film, georeference photography, and questionnaires, and bring that together with multi-dated imagery to really evidence the baselines and the changing patterns, to look at these drivers in a much more detailed and effective way. And if we can do that at a greater resolution that's being done at the moment, then I think you're going to get a much more informed community. And that's not just the donors, the stakeholders, the beneficiaries can be brought into this as well. And then far better solutions in terms of immediate support back, better targeted and delivered. And there's huge scope for that.
That's really helpful. Michelle, can I come to you? So in terms of what Richard was talking about, in terms of needs assessment, are you seeing anything like that happening with those that you're working with?
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the things that is important, especially when you're looking at an area where communities tend to exist, and it depends on where the location, the ecosystem that they're sort of living in, whether it's a savanna or mountainous areas, or whether they've got lots of wetlands within their sites. I think it's important to have as Richard mentioned, a baseline as to how are they coping with what's going on, not just with the floods, but also the droughts, because one of the things that's happening in a lot of these communities also is that they're seeing, because of the shift in the time period of when droughts occur, for example, they can't, reap their farmlands, or they're seeing less access to foods. And so it's seeing what works where and what communities are doing, what sort of activities that each community does in order to get whether they're successful or not. A needs assessment is important. I think a lot of communities tend to do that to some extent right now, because they kind of look back at what they did previously, but they don't adapt very well to the changes, like the future changes. So they'll say, okay, we did this last year, and therefore we'll continue doing it this year. But they don't sort of predict perhaps what's going to be occurring the next couple of years. And that's, I think, where we have to start, shifting them forward and seeing how they can then use the information like geospatial data or even local knowledge into figuring out, well, how do they then plan for future changes? And I think that's where some of this needs assessment also has to look at. Some communities have done it with their community management plan, but I think there's still a lot to go in terms of like identifying where these hotspots for either fire or even flooding or whatever sort of event tends to occur.
That's really helpful. So some good stuff going on, but actually we can still go even further, moving forward. Aravind, I've got a question for you, and I might ask the same of Richard as well. So this is getting into the technical stuff. So for your products, are you going with internally developed platforms for your constellations or commercial off-the-shelf solutions?
I think there was an announcement recently about that we chose Astra Digital, which is a US-based satellite platform integrator and manufacturer for our first two satellites. So that's what we're doing for the first two satellites. So we can call it the second category because we are not developing our own platform. And we are evaluating options for our full operational constellation, which is going to be about 30 satellites. So that we are evaluating currently.
Fabulous, thanks. Richard, how about you? Commercial off-the-shelf stuff or?
We did, yes. Commercial off-the-shelf for us, we're typically Esri users for geospatial, and then satellite imagery from a range of different providers. We don't have the time or the bandwidth to be busy developing these other technology solutions, but what we do is partner with these organizations who are developing them, and part of our R&D strategy is to work with them to develop these new methods, the new methodologies that we can bring into these challenge spaces to help others, these donors, these stakeholder beneficiary groups, make better decisions using them.
Yeah, really helpful. So I've got another question come in. So this might draw on your knowledge because it's indirectly sort of associated with what we've been talking about. So a question's come in from Stephen, and he's asked, have you seen a clear indication in the need to invest in sanitization equipment to make water fit for purpose? He's spoken about 3D imagery and soil content does help us find the purest water source for the required use, but we need to manage change as we do. So have you seen any indications there? Alison's smiling, so I'm taking that as you'd like to say something, Alison, so I shall pass to you.
Sorry, I'm laughing because my technical knowledge goes as far as if you see a big termite hill, there's probably a good chance that there's a good water source. So I don't know if that counts as an answer. But I do know the water NGOs who do go in, this is in Uganda and South Sudan. As a key component of what they do is around the educating of people to make sure that the communities maintain the boreholes and where the water's coming from, and that down to keep the cows away this should be for people, not the livestock, and the importance of water, sanitation, hygiene, and washing your hands. And this has really been important during coronavirus, is making sure that the people that we support don't have soap. So we've got to make sure that they've got soap and that they learn to wash their hands. They don't have bathrooms, they don't have toilets. So it's really very, very basic, but anything we can do to make that water, and then of course boiling the water if you're not sure, but the water does tend, but I'm afraid my technical knowledge sticks with termites. Sorry, Stephen.
Has anybody else got anything that they can add to that for Stephen? Nope. I'll tell you what we'll do, Stephen. So there's a great platform that the KTN have actually set up for the duration of our COP26 activities, and on there you can actually link with anybody who's participating in the event via sending a chat or by sending a message or asking for a one-to-one. So what I would do if I was in your situation, I'd do a little bit of cyber stalking on that platform and have a look and see either who else is speaking later on during these episodes that we're actually delivering, or have a look and see who's on that platform that you can connect with to answer this one. Alison.
And I can connect you, Stephen, if you would like detail with someone who another NGO who does do it, and they would be able to answer, an American NGO called Drop in the Bucket, who do this every day.
There you go. Do you know what, this is one of the things that I love about KTN. We are absolutely in there in terms of connecting for change. Thank you very much, Alison. So a question that I would like to ask you, when we're looking at either people changing careers or influencing our young people that are coming up through thinking about their future careers, so science, technology, engineering and maths, what advice would you give them? And I suppose it's like, how did you get into the area that you're into, and what advice would you give anybody interested in coming into your area? So Aravind, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Michelle, Richard, and then Alison.
Well, I think in terms of people wanting to get into the career, obviously it's a question of what domain interests them. It can be, I come from the world of software before I got into the world of space. And essentially I realized that at the end of the day, it boils down to having software skills. At the end of the day, you're making a software product that's used by an end user. It can be a mobile app. It's a web tool that shows. So if you don't want to get into, let's say, the deep tech, which is more the geospatial side of things, or the meteorological side of things, or even the remote sensing side of things, you can still be in software and get into this industry, because obviously that is essentially what makes the tool. We've discussed about providing insights, and only software tools do that. Even if you send out a satellite and it collects data, the only way it gets or becomes useful information is when it's included inside a software product. It can be your weather app, it can be the location-based apps that you use that today uses GPS signals that you might not, you just take it for granted, but it has all of the underlying technologies inside. So at the outset, software, that's what comes to mind. But then obviously it's about choosing the domain of interest, whether it's if it's respect to space, even in space, what part of space makes sense to you? Is it building satellites? Is it working on the propulsion for the satellites? Is it working on the communication for the satellites? Or is it about building the satellites that take these pictures, which is very, optical engineering, right? If you were to take high resolution pictures that Richard was showing earlier. So it's a question of, identifying where the domain interest lies in. And even if you don't have any, even if you're just coming from the outside, from a software point of view, you still have something to contribute here. So that's kind of what I think.
Fabulous. Michelle, any advice for those listening that are looking for careers in your area?
Yeah, I mean, I come from a conservation background before getting into remote sensing, but I think, having, I think Arvind mentioned this, whatever passion, whether it's the hardware side or software, you're going to follow whichever. But I think irrespective of whichever field or section that you're going into, I think communication skills are very important, because at some point you will have to talk to somebody and you will have to share your ideas and your to get progress. So communication skills are very important. I think sometimes we forget about the resilience of people, and I think that's very important. because that is what will see you through. And that is, it's not the great successes that makes who you are in these fields. Oftentimes, putting in the hard work, working smart, and also communicating well. And I think that's a very important aspect that I would say to anyone, irrespective of whichever field or whichever pathway you go.
Wonderful, thank you. Richard, advice from you.
Brilliant, Michelle. Absolutely agree with you completely on that point. I think for us, Alcis sits as that sort of with a leg in both camps of both the technology and the user community. And a couple of weeks ago, it was World Space Week. And Alison worked with some of our new members of staff in the company to develop videos that were going to be played at World Space Week at schools and colleges. And it was brilliant because one of them, this young lady, talked about her time at school, at university, doing a geography degree and her passions, which were about the Earth, the planet, climate, environment. She gets the technology, she gets GIS, she gets space station. That's fantastic. And then we had another member of staff, this other lady, who's in our business development team. And her role is to try and make these technologies and methods relevant to our clients. And so often trying to answer client needs with a technology solution. And she has no technology background. She doesn't understand or didn't understand geo and satellite systems. But what she did understand as wanting to be a human rights lawyer was about the needs that people might have on the ground in terms of interventions to support them and how they and their voices might be heard so that solutions can be provided to them. And therefore, hearing from someone with a non-tech background who did a politics degree, working in the space sector, gives us the perspective that actually to work in space and geo, we need those other people from those other domains and disciplines, be it, just the large range of them. But Michelle, your key point there is we need people to communicate in plain English and not technical speak, because we do ourselves a disservice when we do that.
Brilliant, thank you. Alison, Richard's left you hardly any time at all to offer your insight and wisdom, but there we go, what can you do?
Follow your dreams and don't let anyone put you off and say you can't do something. And you don't, as Richard said, you don't need to be technical, you don't need to be an academic on the NGO side, and you can make a difference. I just thought of my favorite quote is, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. So follow the dreams there.
Do you know what? Great one to finish on, Alison. To all of you here today listening, I guess everybody that's watched and listened to us today would extend their thanks to each and every one of you for your time, for your insights, and also for your honesty in the discussion part of this panel as well. Remember that the platform is there. You're willing to connect with people, make the most of the opportunities that you have as a result of what the KTN are offering over these COP26 activities. And thank you for all of your insights and wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure being with you today, and hope we can spend some time together in the future. And Aravind, just give us a quick reminder of your detailed discussion, which day and time?
On Friday, the 5th at 3 p.m. British time. So looking forward to see most of you there, where we'll go into case studies of how our weather tools are being used across communities in Africa.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for everybody that's joined us. I hope you enjoyed this session, and please join the KTN for more sessions on our COP26. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.